He had his arms around another woman in his own home while his wife stood 20 feet away, holding a glass of champagne she never got to finish. No shouting, no scene, no tears in front of anyone. Celeste Arden simply set the glass down on the marble table, turned around, and walked to their bedroom. Quietly, like she was just tired and needed rest. But what she packed that night wasn't clothes. It was the one thing Adrian Valenti feared, Mafia Boss of New York, a man who had survived assassinations, federal investigations, and blood wars, had never once thought to protect from the woman sleeping beside him for 7 years. And by the time he understood what she had taken, she was already gone. If you've ever loved someone who made you invisible, you need to stay with this story. Subscribe to this channel right now, hit that like button, and drop your city or country in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. Because what Celeste does next will shock you to your core. Don't go anywhere. The party had been Celeste's idea, which was the cruelest irony of the whole night. She had arranged the flowers' white peonies, Adrian's mother's favorite. She had approved the guest list, confirmed the catering, and stood at the entrance to their 42nd floor penthouse for 2 hours, greeting people by name, asking about their children, remembering which senator had just gone through a divorce and knew better than to bring it up. She was good at that. 7 years of practice had made her almost surgically precise when it came to reading a room full of people who were smiling at you while calculating how useful you were to them. The party was for appearances. Everything connected to Adrian Valenti was for appearances. But Celeste had learned long ago that if you were going to live inside a performance, you might as well make it a good one. By 10 o'clock, the penthouse was full. The kind of full that feels electric conversations overlapping, laughter hitting the ceiling, the clink of crystal carrying across the room like a rhythm. Celeste had moved through it all the way she always did. Composed, present, gracious without being soft. She had just finished a conversation with one of Adrian's business associates, a man who imported pharmaceuticals, and asked too many questions about things that had nothing to do with pharmaceuticals, when she noticed that. Adrian had been absent from the main room for a while. That wasn't unusual. Adrian often disappeared during his own gatherings to take calls, or to have conversations that couldn't happen in front of 40 people. Privacy was currency in their world, but something made Celeste pause. A feeling she couldn't name exactly. Not suspicion, not yet. More like the particular quiet that settles in your chest right before you understand something you've been almost knowing for a long time. She crossed the room, excused herself from 2 women who were discussing real estate, and moved toward the east wing of the penthouse. The hallway was dimmer than the main floor. The noise from the party became distant. She turned the corner near the study. Through the partially open door, she saw them. Adrian's hand was at the small of a woman's back, low, familiar, deliberate. His face was close to hers, and the woman tall, dark-haired, with the particular posture of someone who had been carefully placed in that room, was tilted toward him with the ease of something that had happened before. More than once. Many times before. Celeste recognized her immediately. Sabine Kessler. She had been introduced into their circle approximately 4 months ago through Gideon Rusk, Adrian's consigliere, as the new financial consultant for one of their legitimate restaurant holdings. Celeste had shaken her hand at a dinner. She had thought, elegant woman, careful eyes, the kind of person who listens more than she speaks. She had not thought, threat. She stood in the hallway for she didn't know. 7 seconds, maybe 15, long enough to see what it was. Long enough to understand that this was not a momentary lapse or an ambiguous moment she could reframe in her own mind into something innocent. Long enough to feel the thing inside her chest that was not quite grief and not quite rage, but something older and quieter than both. Then she turned around. She walked back down the hallway, back into the main room. She picked up the glass of champagne she had set on the marble table near the entrance. She held it for exactly 1 breath. Then she set it back down. She did not go back to the conversation she had left. She did not seek out Adrian. She did not find an ally or a friend or a quiet corner to fall apart in. Celeste Arden walked to the master bedroom of her own home, closed the door behind her, and sat down on the edge of the bed in the dark. She did not cry. She sat very still and thought clearly, which was the thing about Celeste. Most people had always underestimated her absolute, almost frightening ability to think clearly in the moments when most people could not think at all. She had been doing the math on this marriage for a while. She had not wanted to finish the equation. Now she had no choice. She knew sitting in that dark room, while 40 people drank champagne 30 feet away, that the decision she made in the next hour would determine the rest of her life. Not just the next weeks, not just the next year, the rest of it. She could go back out there. She could choose to unknow what she had just seen. She could fold it into the collection of other things she had unknowed over the years and continue building the careful, parallel life she had been constructing for longer than she wanted to admit. Or she could do what she had secretly prepared herself to do. In the closet, behind a panel in the back wall, a panel Adrian had never once opened in 7 years because he had never needed to. Because in 7 years he had never once thought his wife might need an exit he didn't know about. There was a compartment. Inside the compartment, a single encrypted ledger, handwritten, organized with the particular precision of someone who had spent 7 years watching an empire operate from the inside. Account numbers, dates, names, financial structures that looked legitimate until you followed them 3 layers deep. The map of everything Adrian Valenti controlled. Celeste had built it herself, gradually, across years. Not as a weapon. Originally as protection, the kind that every woman in her position eventually understands she needs. Even if she prays, she'll never use it. She had never used it. She stood up from the bed. She went to the closet. She opened the panel. The ledger was exactly where she had left it, wrapped in cloth, inside a fireproof case the size of a hardcover book. She took it out, set it on the bed, opened her suitcase, not the decorative one Adrian had given her for their 5th anniversary, but her own, the one she had bought herself 2 years ago, and kept packed with the things that actually mattered. A passport in her own name. Cash she had moved quietly into accounts he didn't have access to. Documents she needed. The clothes she would have chosen, not the ones that existed because of him. She moved efficiently, not frantically efficiently. There is a difference. Frenzy is fear. Efficiency is decision. She packed the ledger last. Then she stood at the vanity mirror and looked at herself for a moment. She was wearing a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her hair was arranged perfectly. She looked exactly like the wife of a mafia boss was supposed to look at a party. She reached up and unclasped her earrings, set them on the vanity. She removed her wedding ring, looked at it for 3 full seconds, then set it beside the earrings. She picked up the suitcase, tucked the ledger case against her body under her coat, and walked out of the master bedroom. Down the service hallway. Not the main hall. She wasn't interested in walking past 40 people and giving Adrian the satisfaction of a scene or the humiliation of her own face breaking in public. She took the service elevator to the parking level, walked to her own car, the one registered in her name, and drove away from Valenti Tower at 10:47 in the evening while her husband was still in the study with his hand on another woman's back. She didn't look in the rearview mirror. Adrian discovered she was gone at 11:30. He had returned to the party, moved through it for another 40 minutes, given the appropriate amount of attention to the appropriate people, and had not once noticed that his wife was absent, which told you everything, really. It was their head of household staff, Elena, who had worked for the Valentis for 11 years, and who genuinely loved Celeste in the way that certain people love someone who has always treated them like a person rather than furniture, who quietly told him. Mrs. Valenti left about an hour ago. She took a bag. Adrian processed that for 2 seconds. Then something rearranged behind his eyes. The expression the room sometimes called the Black King, settling in that particular stillness that preceded something very serious. He excused himself from the couple he was talking to and walked to the master bedroom. He saw the ring on the vanity immediately. He stood in the room without moving for a long moment. Long enough for the reality of it to actually land, which is different from understanding something with your brain. Then he went to the closet. He had no particular reason to go to the closet. He went because he was Adrian Valenti, and when something was wrong, He inventoried everything until he understood the scope of it. He moved through the closet, ran his hand along the back wall the way you do when you're not sure what you're looking for. His fingers found the edge of the panel almost by accident. He pressed it. It opened. Empty. He stood looking at the empty compartment for almost a full minute. His mind was racing through the implications faster than most people could process a grocery list, but his face was almost completely still. Then he sat down on the edge of the bed, the same spot where Celeste had sat 2 hours earlier, and did something no one in his organization had ever seen him do. He put his face in his hands. Not for long. Maybe 30 seconds. Then he straightened up, and the stillness came back. And the 30 seconds on the edge of the bed was something that would never be mentioned to anyone, because it happened alone. He picked up his phone and called Marco, his head of security. Find my wife. Where should we? I don't care where you start. Find her, and when we find her. Adrian's voice was flat and very clear. Nobody touches her. Nobody frightens her. Nobody puts a hand near her. You find her and you call me. That's all. He hung up. Then he called Gideon Rusk. Gideon arrived at the penthouse within 40 minutes, which was fast, but Gideon had always been fast when it mattered. He was 60 years old, compact and careful, with the particular manner of someone who had survived long enough in a dangerous world to become indispensable. He had been there at the beginning, when Adrian was 31, and inheriting an organization that was bleeding from 3 different directions, after his father's health collapsed. He had helped Adrian consolidate, rebuild, make the hard choices that needed to be made. There was a kind of loyalty that comes from surviving something difficult with someone, and Adrian had operated on the assumption of Gideon's loyalty for 7 years. He did not question it that night. She's gone, Adrian said. Gideon sat across from him. He was the kind of man who listened with his whole face. How long? Hour and a half, maybe 2. She took the car? Her car. Her bag. Adrian paused, and something from a compartment in the closet. A ledger. Something moved across Gideon's expression. Quick. Gone. You had a ledger? Celeste kept records. For years. Adrian looked at his hands. I didn't know the extent of it. Gideon was quiet for a beat longer than he needed to be. She was your wife. You trusted her. I underestimated her. Those were different things and Adrian knew it. I need to find her before she does something with it. Gideon nodded slowly. I'll put people on it. Quietly, he paused. Do you want me to contact the families? In case she reaches out to? No. Adrian cut that off immediately. This stays inside the organization. And Gideon. He looked at him directly. The first person who puts any pressure on her answers to me personally. Gideon studied him for a moment. You think she'll use it against you? Adrian was quiet. I think Celeste is the most careful person I've ever met. And I spent 7 years not paying enough attention to what she was doing with that carefulness. He stood up. Find her. But Celeste was already 3 hours ahead of them. She had not gone to a hotel. Hotels had records, card transactions, cameras at entrances. She had not contacted anyone from their circle because everyone from their circle was connected to Adrian in ways that had nothing to do with loyalty to her. She had driven for 2 hours in a direction she had planned for this possibility without ever letting herself believe she would use the plan. The Connecticut safe house was not registered to any name Adrian would recognize. It was a quiet place off a 2-lane road with a furnace that took 15 minutes to warm up and a kitchen that smelled like old wood and stillness. She had rented it through a shell that connected back to nothing useful. It had taken her 8 months to set it up. She had told herself at the time that she was being overly cautious. She was sitting at the kitchen table at 2 a.m, the ledger open in front of her and a cup of coffee growing cold beside it when she found the first thing that changed everything. She had built the ledger as a record of the Valenti Empire. She knew what it contained. She knew every account number, every front company, every arrangement. She had been reading it for 6 months in pieces, keeping it updated, organized. But she had never sat down and read the whole thing in sequence, from beginning to present, specifically looking for patterns. She was doing that now, and something was wrong. She turned the pages slowly, made notes on a legal pad beside her. The coffee went completely cold. The furnace clanked and hummed. By 4 in the morning, she had covered 3 years of entries. By 5:30, she had confirmed it. There was a pattern that didn't belong to Adrian. A series of financial movements that ran parallel to the legitimate operations she had documented, quiet, methodical, constructed so carefully that you would miss them unless you were looking at everything simultaneously across a long stretch of time. Money moving out through structures she recognized, but that Adrian had never authorized. Amounts that were individually small enough to pass unnoticed in a large operation, but that added up across 37 months to something significant. And the movements weren't random. They were building something. Not dismantling building. A parallel structure. Separate accounts, separate relationships, separate channels that ran alongside the Valenti organization like a shadow version of the same map. Celeste sat back from the table. She looked at the window, where the Connecticut dawn was just beginning to suggest itself in gray light at the edge of the trees. She was thinking about Gideon Rusk, not because she had proof yet she didn't. Not yet, but because she had spent 7 years in the same rooms as these financial structures, and she knew which hands had access to which moving parts, and the pattern she was looking at required access that very few people possessed. She turned back to the ledger. She started again from the beginning. She was going to need to be absolutely certain before she touched this. Because if she was right, Celeste Arden had not just left her husband with a document that could destroy his empire. She had left him with evidence that someone inside his most trusted circle was already doing exactly that. And she had walked out the door before she understood that the danger she had taken with her was not the kind that came from Adrian. It was already in the room with him. She did not sleep. Outside, the Connecticut morning arrived cold and pale through the windows, and Celeste turned another page and kept reading. And somewhere in Manhattan, the man who had spent 7 years not paying enough attention to his wife was beginning to understand too late and too slowly exactly how much that had cost him. The first thing that broke in Adrian's empire wasn't something dramatic. It was a warehouse. Pier 17, Red Hook. A storage facility that existed on paper as a legitimate import company dealing in restaurant equipment. 4 in the morning, 3 days after Celeste walked out the door. 16 men on rotation guarding the location. Professional. Experienced. The kind of setup that had held without incident for 4 years. Someone hit it anyway. They came through the water side, which meant they knew the land approach was covered. They knew the rotation schedule, which changed weekly and was communicated only through channels inside the Valenti organization. They were in and out in 11 minutes, which meant they knew exactly what they were looking for and exactly where it was. 7 men were hospitalized. Nothing was killed. $2 million in untraceable assets was gone. Marco called Adrian at 4:47 in the morning. Adrian was already awake because he had not slept. He listened to the report with the phone pressed to his ear and his eyes on the Manhattan skyline through the penthouse window that Celeste had always said faced the wrong direction. Who knew the rotation? Adrian asked. Inner circle only. 8 people, including me. Including Gideon? A pause. He gets the security briefings. Standard. Adrian said nothing for a moment. Outside, the city was doing what it always did, functioning. Indifferent. Enormous. Get Dominic Serrano on the phone. Not the usual line. His personal cell. It's 5 in the morning. I know what time it is. He hung up. Walked to the kitchen. Made coffee himself, which he almost never did because there was always someone to do it. But at 5 in the morning, in an empty penthouse, he was not interested in pressing a button to summon anyone. He stood at the counter and drank the coffee while it was still too hot and thought about 2 things simultaneously. The first was the warehouse. The second was the look on Gideon's face when he said the word ledger, that fraction of a second where something moved across his expression before he locked it back down. Adrian had seen that look on many faces over the years. He knew what it meant. He just wasn't ready yet to follow it where it led. Gideon arrived at Valenti headquarters at 7 that morning, which was normal. He moved through the building with his usual deliberate pace, stopping to speak with 2 of the captains, reviewing the morning's reports, with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for 30 years. He knocked on Adrian's office door at 7:15. "Come in." Adrian was behind his desk. He looked like he had slept. He hadn't, but he looked like he had, which was a skill. Gideon sat down. "You heard about the warehouse last night." "I've been looking at it since 4 this morning." Gideon set a folder on the desk. Whoever planned this had operational knowledge. The water approach, the rotations. "I know. It's possible, Celeste. It's not, Celeste." The words came out flat and final, with the particular weight of something Adrian had already decided and was not going to revisit. "She's been gone 72 hours. This took planning." Gideon looked at him steadily. She had the ledger for years. If she shared information before she left, Celeste didn't share anything with anyone. Adrian leaned back. "She doesn't work that way. You sound very certain about a woman who apparently built a secret compartment in your own home, without you knowing." The sentence landed with the precision of something that had been prepared. Adrian noticed that. He filed it. "What do you have on the attack?" he asked. Gideon ran through the details. Organized, thorough, the way he always was. Adrian listened and watched him simultaneously, which was a skill you developed when you survived long enough in rooms where the most dangerous thing in them was usually wearing a pleasant expression. When Gideon finished, Adrian nodded. "Double the security on the Bronx properties. And the Midtown offices." "Done." Gideon stood. "And Celeste?" "My people are looking. If she reaches out to anyone, she won't." Adrian said it with the quiet confidence of a man who knew his wife and then felt the immediate, sharp irony of that knowing his wife settle somewhere uncomfortable in his chest. "That's all, Gideon." Gideon left. Adrian sat at his desk for a while without moving. Then he picked up the phone and called a number he had memorized years ago and never saved anywhere. The man who answered on the third ring was not part of the Valenti organization. He was an independent, a forensic accountant who had done quiet work for 3 different families over 20 years. "Discreet, expensive, reliable. I need you to look at something," Adrian said. "Quietly." "How quietly? Nobody knows you're looking." "Nobody." He paused. "I'll send you access to the main account structures by tonight." "Timeline?" "Fast." He hung up and sat in the silence of his office, and for the first time since Celeste had walked out, he felt something that was not anger and not grief, but something more dangerous than both. Doubt. Celeste had not slept in 40 hours when she found the Sabine connection. She had been working through the ledger in sections, reconstructing the financial timeline she had documented, cross-referencing it with the parallel movements she had identified that first night. She had covered 6 legal pads with notes. She had made 3 pots of coffee and eaten almost nothing. The Connecticut safe house had a particular quality of silence that felt appropriate. No city noise, just the occasional sound of wind moving through trees and the settling of an old building doing what old buildings do. She had started the search for the origin point of the parallel structure, because that's how you find the author. You find where something began, not where it is now. The earliest movement she could trace was 38 months ago. A small transfer, unremarkable in isolation, but it pointed back to a specific account number she recognized. She had documented that account herself 14 months earlier as part of Adrian's legitimate restaurant holdings. The account had been established through a law firm in Midtown. The firm's name appeared in the ledger twice more, both times connected to financial structures that Adrian had sanctioned. But the account itself, the original one, the source of that first quiet movement, had been created 4 months before Adrian authorized any business relationship with that law firm. Someone had already established the infrastructure before Adrian ever knew the firm existed. Celeste sat very still with that information for a full minute. Then she turned back through the ledger to the entry where that law firm first appeared, in Adrian's legitimate business records. The recommendation had come from Gideon. She wrote that down, circled it, sat back. Then she opened the small laptop she had brought with her and pulled up the public filing records for the law firm. Simple research, the kind that left no footprint if you did it carefully. The firm had 4 listed partners. She ran each name through the public corporate registration database. One of the partners, a man named Elias Forte, appeared as a registered agent for a holding company incorporated in Delaware 14 months before that first quiet financial movement. She ran the holding company. It connected, through 2 layers, to a property management group in New Jersey. She ran the property management group, and there, in a list of business contacts filed with a routine regulatory disclosure, she found a name: Sabine Kessler. Celeste did not move for a long time. Sabine had been introduced into their circle 4 months ago. She had been introduced by Gideon. She had been presented as a financial consultant for their restaurant holdings, which meant the accounts that ran through that specific law firm. The accounts that had been the source of the parallel structure. Sabine had not wandered into Adrian's orbit. She had been installed there. Celeste stood up from the table, abruptly, walked to the small window above the kitchen sink, and looked out at the Connecticut trees for a while. Her hands were completely still on the counter. She breathed carefully, the way you do when you're controlling something that wants to move through you too fast. She had left Adrian because of what she saw in that study. A man she had spent 7 years beside, choosing to betray her. She still believed that was his choice. Whatever the circumstances around Sabine, whatever the manipulation involved, Adrian had made a decision with his own hands, and she was not going to let complexity erase that. But the complexity existed, and it changed things. Not what he had done, what she needed to do next. She went back to the table, picked up her phone, held it for a moment. Then she dialed Adrian's number. He picked up on the second ring. Celeste. His voice was immediate. Not relieved, something more careful than relief. "I'm not calling to come back," she said. "I need you to understand that before I say anything else." A pause. "Okay. And I need you to come alone. No security. No recording. No one following the car." "That's not." "Adrian." She waited. "Do you want to hear what I found or not?" The silence on his end lasted about 4 seconds. She knew what he was calculating. She let him calculate. "Where?" he said. She gave him the address. "Give me 4 hours." "You have 3, she said, "and if I see anyone with you, I'm gone and I take what I know with me." She hung up before he could respond. Then she sat down, picked up her legal pad, and kept working. Because Adrian would use 3 hours to try to trace the call. She knew that. She had used a burner. What he would find was a cell tower in a 2-mile radius of a town that had 400 residents and no useful surveillance infrastructure. She had another hour and 40 minutes of notes to get through before he arrived. She wasn't going to waste them. He came alone. She heard the car on the gravel road 20 minutes before the 3-hour mark. One car. She watched through the window just one set of headlights, moving at a reasonable speed. Not the way armed security moves. When the knock came at the door, she didn't answer it immediately. She finished the paragraph of notes she was writing. Then she went to the door and opened it. Adrian Valenti, who operated as one of the most feared men in New York, stood on the front step of a rented Connecticut safe house looking, and she noticed this without particular satisfaction, like a man who had slept about as well as she had. He was wearing a dark coat, no tie. His hands were visible, which she appreciated, even if he didn't know that. They looked at each other for a moment on the threshold. "You found it," he said, not a question. "Come inside," she said. She had the legal pads arranged on the table in chronological order. The ledger was open to the relevant entries. She had laid it out the way she used to arrange financial presentations for the organization: clear, sequential, evidence first, and conclusion after. She did not offer him coffee. She walked him through it. She started at the beginning, the earliest financial movement, the account origin, the law firm, the timeline. She spoke without flourish, just the facts in sequence, the connections, the documentation. Her voice was steady. Adrian stood at the table and read what she pointed to. He did not interrupt. He was one of those rare people who could actually absorb information while it was being delivered, which was part of what had made him effective. When she reached Gideon's name, she watched his face. He was very still. "Read this entry," she said, pointed to a line in the ledger. "Then this one, 18 months later. Then this." He read them. "Read them again." "The law firm," he said. "Gideon recommended them for the Midtown accounts." "I know. I approved it." This account was set up through them 4 months before you approved anything. Silence. Someone with enough access to the Midtown account structure had to have flagged the firm to Gideon before he brought it to you, Celeste said. Or Gideon flagged it himself, set the infrastructure in advance, and brought you the recommendation when the timing was right. Adrian's jaw moved. You found the property company. I found Sabine's name on the registration. She watched that land. It was not pleasant to watch. She had not wanted to take satisfaction in it, and she didn't, but she observed the particular kind of damage a revelation does when it arrives, wrapped in something you already knew was wrong. Adrian sat down slowly in the chair across from her. For maybe 30 seconds, he didn't say anything. Then she was placed. Yes, by Gideon. The connection goes through his structures. I can't give you a recording of the conversation where he decided this. But the financial paper trail connects them before she ever entered your life. Adrian put one hand flat on the table, not a dramatic gesture. The kind of thing a person does when they're keeping themselves from doing something else. She was bait, he said. Celeste looked at him. She was a mechanism. Yes, another silence. Then Adrian looked up at her. That doesn't... No, she said immediately, and her voice had an edge in it that she didn't try to soften. Don't. I know what you're going to say, and the answer is no. She was placed in your path. You still walked to her with your own 2 feet. In your own home. While I was in the next room. She paused. Gideon opened a door. You chose to walk through it. Those are 2 separate things, and I am holding both of them. The silence after that was different. Heavier. Adrian didn't argue. She half expected him to. He was not, in general, a man who received accountability without at least attempting a defense. But he sat at her kitchen table in a Connecticut safe house and looked at the legal pads and did not argue. What's his endgame? Adrian asked finally. The Empire. She sat down across from him. He's been building a parallel structure for over 3 years. It's not just taking money, he's constructing a replacement. New alliances, separate channels. He's been feeding intelligence to rival families and staging attacks to weaken you from the outside while bleeding the organization from the inside. She turned one of the legal pads toward him. Look at the territorial losses over the past 14 months. The Bronx situation last spring. The Midtown arrangement falling apart. The Red Hook warehouse. Adrian went very still. The warehouse was 3 days ago. I know. How did you know about... He stopped. I had the radio on, Celeste said flatly. And I've been awake for 40 hours, reading every financial movement of the organization you're running. I recognized the target immediately. She paused. It wasn't random. That facility appears in the ledger, connect to a specific account number that Gideon's parallel structure has been circling for 2 years. Adrian stared at the table. He's been waiting, Celeste said. He's been patient. 3 years of patient. And now something accelerated his timeline. You leaving. Adrian said it without looking up. Me leaving with the ledger, she said. He would have known about the compartment. Adrian looked up at her sharply. He knew about it? I don't know what he knew about it. But if he had enough access to your inner operations to do all of this, she gestured at the table. He would have known I was keeping records. He'd never told me. No, Celeste said. He didn't. The implications of that settled in the room like weather. Adrian left her at midnight. She had made him copies photographs of the relevant pages, organized the same way she had organized the originals. She had walked him through the methodology twice until she was certain. He understood not just the conclusions, but how she had arrived at them, because conclusions without methodology were just accusations. At the door, he stopped. He put his hand in his coat pocket, and she saw before she could fully prepare herself that he was holding her wedding ring. He had picked it up off the vanity before he left the penthouse. She hadn't thought about the ring since she'd set it down. He didn't reach for her hand. He looked at the ring for a moment and then looked at her. I'm not asking you to come back, he said. I know what I did. She didn't say anything. I just needed you to know. He stopped. Tried again. The ring was on the counter, and I didn't want to leave it there. Put it in your pocket, Celeste said quietly. You can hold on to it. He looked at her. Then he put it back in his pocket. He turned and walked to the car. She watched through the window until the headlights disappeared down the gravel road. Then she sat back down at the table, picked up the legal pad, and went back to work. She had more of the ledger to cross-reference. She estimated another 6 or 7 hours before she had fully mapped the parallel structure. She would sleep after. At 2:15 in the morning, her phone rang. Unknown number. But the ring pattern was one. She recognized 2 rings. Stop. 2 rings from a protocol she and Adrian had established years ago for emergency contact through alternative channels. She picked up. It was not Adrian. The voice was male. Unfamiliar. Careful. Mrs. Valenti, I'm not Mrs. Valenti, she said. Her hand tightened on the phone. The lady with the ledger, then. A pause. We know where you are. She was already on her feet, moving across the kitchen. Mr. Rusk wants it back, the voice said. He's offering a fair arrangement. Nobody gets hurt. Tell Rush she started. He's not asking, ma'am. He's informing you of the situation. Another pause. You have about 15 minutes before we knock on your door. He'd prefer you answer it. The line went dead. Celeste stood in the kitchen of the Connecticut safe house with a dead phone in her hand, and 15 minutes on a clock she hadn't started yet. She moved. She grabbed the ledger first, then the legal pads, the laptop, the cash from the interior pocket of her bag. She was into her coat and at the back door of the house in under 90 seconds, which was fast for someone who had been awake for 42 hours. But fear has a particular way of clarifying what your body is capable of. She went through the back, into the trees. There was a road on the other side. She had scoped it the first day, because Celeste had always been the kind of person who identified the second X before she used the first one. Behind her, through the trees, she saw headlights coming up the gravel road from the front. She moved faster. The ledger was pressed against her body under her coat, the way she had carried it out of Valenti Tower the night the marriage ended. She reached the other road, flagged a passing truck agricultural, heading east. The driver, a heavy-set man who looked at her with the cautious concern of someone understood that a woman alone on a back road at 2 in the morning had ended up there through no good circumstance. I need to get to the next town, she said. He looked at her for a second. Get in. She was 20 miles away when she called Adrian. He picked up immediately, which meant he wasn't sleeping either. Gideon's people found the safe house. She kept her voice even. They called ahead. I got out. The silence on his end lasted exactly 1 second. Are you hurt? No. Where are you? Moving. She paused. Adrian, listen to me. This changes his timeline. He knows I've been looking at the ledger. He knows I found something. He's not going to wait anymore. I know. He's going to move against you directly. Probably within 48 hours. I know. His voice was very quiet. Celeste, I need to know where you are. I'll contact you again in 6 hours. I need to find somewhere to land first. Let me send. No. She watched the road through the truck's windshield. The driver had the radio on low. Country music, the slow kind. No soldiers, no cars, I'll contact you. She heard him breathe. Okay, he said. She hung up. The truck moved through the dark Connecticut highway, and Celeste sat with the ledger against her ribs and the legal pads in her bag, and the particular feeling of a person who has just confirmed something they already suspected. Gideon had known about the compartment, or he had known about her. Either way, he had monitored the safe house, which meant he had resources she hadn't fully mapped yet, and it meant that somewhere in the paper trail she had spent 40 hours reconstructing, there were still pieces she hadn't found. She needed more time. She needed walls around her. And she realized with the cold clarity of someone operating on no sleep and raw instinct to stop moving blind. The truck driver glanced at her. You okay? I'm fine, she said. Thank you for stopping. He nodded and turned his eyes back to the road. Celeste looked out the side window at the passing dark and thought about Gideon Rusk, who had served Adrian Valenti for 30 years, who had helped build the organization that Adrian inherited, who had been in every room for every critical decision of the last decade. She thought about what it takes for a person to spend 3 years dismantling. From this inside, the thing they spent 30 years building. Not desperation, not impulsiveness, something colder than both. She thought about the warehouse, the political ally who had vanished, the rival family moving onto territory with impossible precision. She thought about Victor Valenti, Adrian's father, the former Don, living in memory care upstate. She had visited him twice this year. He had been lucid one of those times, confused the other. Something nagged at her about Victor. She couldn't get the feeling to sharpen into something specific. She was too tired. She filed it and kept moving. Somewhere behind her, on a gravel road in Connecticut, men who worked for Gideon Russ were standing in front of an empty safe house with an empty kitchen table and a cold pot of coffee, reporting back that the woman with the ledger was gone again. And somewhere in Manhattan, Gideon himself was receiving that report, and understanding that his window was closing. He had spent 3 years being patient. The patience was over. The motel outside Bridgeport Court cost $47 a night and smelled like 6 exits that had been smoked there during a different decade. Celeste paid cash at the front desk, took the key from a man who didn't look at her face, and found room 11 at the end of a concrete walkway where 2 of the 4 overhead lights had burned out and nobody had replaced them. She locked the door, put the chain on, set the ledger on the bed. Then she sat on the floor with her back against the wall, not the bed, the floor, because the floor was solid, and she needed solid right now, and held her phone in both hands, and stared at the water-stained ceiling for approximately 90 seconds. That was all she allowed herself. Then she opened the legal pad and kept working. She had 6 hours before she would contact Adrian again. 6 hours was enough to finish the mapping if she pushed. She was running on coffee, and the particular kind of wired exhaustion where your thoughts are faster than usual, but your hands shake slightly when you hold a pen too long. She switched the pen to her left hand for a while. Kept writing. By 4 in the morning, she had reconstructed the full shape of what Gideon had built. It was, she had to admit, in the cold privacy of her own mind, impressive in its patience. 37 months of quiet construction. The parallel financial structure wasn't just a shadow empire, it was a replacement. Gideon had been building the successor organization to the Valenti family, from the inside of the Valenti family, using Valenti resources, Valenti relationships, and Valenti intelligence to do it. He had rebuilt the contacts list, not copied rebuilt. Approached the same political allies, the same import channels, the same protection arrangements, through slightly different intermediaries, over a long enough period that nobody had noticed the overlap. He had done this before. That was what the paper trail said, if you read it the right way. The methodology was too clean for a first attempt. Gideon Rusk had done this before, somewhere, to someone. He had rebuilt an organization from the rubble of another one, and he had learned something from that process about how to do it without being seen. She wrote that down and circled it 3 times. Then, the thing that had been nagging at her since the truck, the thing about Victor, finally sharpened. She went back through the ledger to the entries from 14 months ago, the same period when the parallel structure's activity had intensified. There was a notation she had made herself, almost in passing, about a property in Westchester that had been transferred out of the Valenti holdings into a medical trust. She had documented it as routine. Victor Valenti's care arrangements being formalized. She had not looked at who administers the trust. She looked now. The trustee was listed as a law firm, the same Midtown law firm. Celeste sat up straighter. Her back ached from the floor and she didn't care. She cross-referenced the trust documentation against the law firm's registration. The firm had been granted medical power of attorney over Victor Valenti's affairs 14 months ago, on the grounds that Adrian Valenti, as the primary family member, faced conflicts of interest due to the nature of his business interests. It was the kind of legal arrangement that sounded reasonable in isolation. Victor needed care. Adrian's situations made clean legal arrangements complicated. The firm was already handling Valenti legitimate business interests. But the firm was Gideon's infrastructure, which meant Gideon held medical power of attorney over Adrian's father. Celeste set the legal pad down on the motel bed and pressed both hands flat against her thighs and breathed. Victor Valenti was not just Adrian's father. He was the former Don. He had built the original empire in the 70s and 80s, and buried in the structure of that original empire, in accounts that had been dormant for 20 years, were assets that had never been formally transferred to Adrian's generation of the organization. The original Valenti holdings, tens of millions in dormant assets that required Victor's personal authorization and information to access. She had always assumed Adrian controlled those assets. It had seemed logical. Victor was his father. Adrian ran the organization. But if the medical power of attorney sat with Gideon's law firm, and if Victor's cognitive state made his own authorization unreliable, Gideon didn't need Adrian's organization. He needed Victor's authorization codes, and he needed them before Victor lost whatever lucidity remained. She called Adrian at 4:47 in the morning, an hour and 13 minutes earlier than she had told him. He picked up before the second ring. "Victor," she said. "Where is your father right now?" A pause. "Memory care facility in Westchester." "Why? Who holds his medical power of attorney?" The pause this time was longer. "Adrian." "Look it up," Celeste said. "Find the actual documentation and look at who the named trustee is." She heard him moving, heard the particular sound of someone pulling files, or clicking through a computer, or waking someone up to get access to something at 4:40 in the morning. 40 seconds of silence, then the 40 firm, which is Gideon's firm. It was a routine arrangement. "My lawyers recommended." "Adrian," she kept her voice flat and direct. "Gideon has POA over your father. And your father has authorization information connected to the original Valenti assets. The dormant accounts from before you took over." The silence this time was different. She could almost hear him thinking, and she recognized the quality of it, the specific silence of someone rearranging everything they thought they understood. "He's been visiting him," Adrian said. His voice had gone very quiet. "What?" "The facility director called me 6 weeks ago. Said Gideon had been coming by. I assumed." He stopped. "I assumed he was being respectful. My father knows him. They have history." Celeste closed up her eyes 1 second. "How often?" 3 times in the last 2 months. Maybe more." His voice tightened. "I didn't ask for details." "You need to get there now," Celeste said. "Not in an hour." Now she heard him already moving. "I'll call the facility." "Don't call. Go." She was standing, gathering the legal pads. A phone call gives someone the opportunity to say your father isn't available. You show up in person with your face. "I'll be there in 40 minutes. Call me when you see him." He hung up without saying anything else. Celeste stood in the middle of the $47 motel room with the ledger in one hand and the phone in the other, and felt the particular nausea of someone who has almost understood something and is afraid of what the rest of the understanding looks like. Adrian drove himself. No security detail, no Marco in the passenger seat, no armed car following behind. He had started doing this 3 days ago, after the warehouse attack, when he had finally accepted that he couldn't identify the leak and therefore couldn't trust anyone in the operational security until he knew where Gideon's people were planted. He drove 45 minutes to Westchester with his phone on the seat beside him and his foot doing things to the accelerator that would have generated tickets on any road with active monitoring. Ridgeview Memory Care was a residential facility set back from the road behind a wrought iron gate that operated on a keypad. Adrian had the code. He had always had the code because he visited regularly, once a week or sometimes twice, sitting in the garden with his father when the weather was good and in the common room when it wasn't. Victor Valenti was 79. He had been diagnosed 4 years ago. Some weeks were better than others. He had periods of startling clarity that felt like gifts and periods of fog that felt like a form of grief you had to keep experiencing fresh each time. Adrian punched the gate code at 4:43 in the morning. The gate opened. He parked and went directly to the night reception desk. The woman at the desk was young, startled to see anyone at this hour, and reaching for a reasonable explanation for why a man in a dark coat was standing at her station before 6 in the morning. "Victor Valenti," Adrian said. "I'm his son. Mr. Valenti, visiting hours don't start until—" "I'm not visiting. I'm checking on his status. Get me the night nurse who oversees his wing." The authority in his voice was not aggressive. It was simply absolute. The way gravity is absolute, not demanding. Just the way things are. The woman reached for the phone. The night nurse arrived in 2 minutes. Same was a tag on her chest that Adrian registered and immediately forgot. She was competent looking and slightly alarmed. "Your father is in his room," she said. "He had a calm evening. He's sleeping." "When was his last visitor?" Adrian asked. She looked at her notes. "Yesterday afternoon. A gentleman came, he's on the approved list." "Mr. Rusk, how long was he here?" "About 2 hours. He brought flowers. They sat in the garden." She paused. "Your father was having a good day. He was quite alert." Adrian kept his face arranged the way it needed to be. "I'd like to see him. He's sleeping. I'd like to see that he's sleeping." He looked at her steadily. "You can accompany me." They walked down the hallway together. Adrian's shoes made sounds on the linoleum that seemed very loud in the early morning quiet of a place where most of the residents were past the point of being disturbed by small sounds. Room 14. The nurse opened the door quietly. Victor Valenti was in the bed. Small now, he had always been a physically large man, but the years had reduced him in the way they sometimes do, the way a winter does to a garden. He was breathing slowly. His hands were on the coverlet. He was alive. Adrian stood in the doorway for a moment and felt something move through him that he was not going to examine carefully at 5:40 in the morning, in a memory care facility, with a nurse standing beside him. Then he looked around the room. On the bed's table, a vase with flowers. Yellow. Gideon's choice. Adrian's father had always said yellow flowers were for kitchens, not sick rooms. Victor would never have chosen yellow. Beside the flowers, a notepad that wasn't from the facility. A personal notepad with the top page, bearing the particular impression of writing done on the page above that ghost of pressure where someone had written something and removed the sheet. Adrian reached past the flowers and picked up the notepad. "Sir," the nurse started. He held it up to the light from the corridor. The impression was faint but readable, if you knew how to look. He had learned how to look at things like this a long time ago. A sequence of numbers. 11 digits arranged in 2 groups. Adrian stood in his father's room at 5:40 in the morning and looked at the ghost of what Gideon had extracted from an old man during 2 hours in a garden with yellow flowers, and felt something in his chest that was colder than anger. He called Celeste from the parking lot. "He's safe," Adrian said. "Gideon was here yesterday. 2 hours. His voice was controlled in the way that things under extreme pressure are controlled tightly, with effort. He got what he came for. The authorization codes. 11 digits. My father probably thought he was helping. He stopped. He has good days and bad days. Yesterday was a good day." Adrian Victor wouldn't have known. He said it firmly like a fact, but there was something else underneath it. He wouldn't have understood what he was giving him. Celeste let that sit for a moment. "Come to me," she said. I need to not be alone with this right now." She said it directly. Not gently, directly. "And I need to show you the rest of what I found." "There's more." A silence. "Where are you?" She gave him the motel address. He arrived at 7:30. He looked worse than he had in Connecticut, which she had not thought was possible. He sat down at the small table in her motel room and looked at the ledger and the legal pads arranged on the bed and didn't say anything for a moment. "How much more?" he said. She sat across from him. "The trust structure around your father's assets is the end game. But there's a trigger built into the structure, a legal mechanism, that would allow the trustee to access those accounts without Victor's ongoing participation if Victor is declared legally incapacitated." Adrian looked at her. "Gideon has already filed the preliminary documentation for incapacitation proceedings," Celeste said. "I found the filing this morning. It's dated 3 days ago. The day after I left." 3 days ago, Adrian repeated slowly. "Your father's medical records for the past 6 months show a pattern of deterioration." She paused. "The documentation is inconsistent with the records I have from the facility's own nursing notes, which I fuss access through the public care licensing filings. The official medical records show a sharper decline than the facility's internal daily notes. Someone altered the records. Someone supplemented them. Added clinical documentation that the facility's own staff didn't write. She watched him. The incapacitation filing will likely succeed unless it's challenged immediately with documentation. And if it succeeds, the trustee Gideon's law firm gains full authority over the dormant accounts. How much is in those accounts? My best estimate from the ledger is between 40 and 60 million. Some of it liquid, some in assets that could be liquidated quickly. Adrian put both elbows on the table and his face in his hands. He sat like that for a while. Celeste did not fill the silence. She had learned over 7 years that Adrian's silences were not empty. They were where he did the work that mattered. She let him do it. He came up from behind his hands. His eyes were steady. Whatever had happened in the room had been processed into something operational. He's calling a council meeting, Adrian said. What? I got a message this morning. Gideon has called an emergency session of the Mafia Council. Tonight. He looked at her. He's accusing you of theft of organization assets. And he's framing my response to your leaving as evidence that I've allowed my personal situation to compromise the organization. Celeste was quiet for a moment. He's moving for the throne. He's moving for the throne, Adrian confirmed. Tonight. With the authorization codes in hand and the incapacitation filing in progress, he doesn't need to wait anymore. He looked at his hands on the table. If I don't appear at that council session and defend my position, my absence is interpreted as guilt. If I appear and I'm wrong about any of this...
You're not wrong.
I know. He looked at her. But knowing and being able to prove it to 15 men who are already calculating which side is safer to be on are two different things. Celeste looked at the legal pads on the bed. When is the meeting? 9 tonight. She looked at the clock. It was 7:52 in the morning. They had 13 hours. Then we have 13 hours, she said. She stood up and went to the bed and picked up the first legal pad. Handed it to him. Start reading, she said. I'll make coffee. They worked through the morning, side by side at the small motel table, which was not big enough for 2 people to work comfortably, but they made it work. Adrian read. Celeste walked him through the methodology. He asked questions, good ones, specific ones, the questions of someone who understood exactly what they were looking at. Around 11, his phone rang. He looked at the screen. Marco, answer it. He answered. Yeah, Marco's voice came clearly, enough that Celeste could hear it from 2 feet away. Boss, I need to see you. In person, not the phone. I'm not at headquarters, I know. A pause. That's why I'm calling the phone. I don't know who's watching the building. Another pause, and something in the quality of that pause was different, not professional. Careful. The way a man is careful when he's about to say something that scares him. Someone moved Victor. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. Say that again. The facility called headquarters looking for you. They couldn't reach your direct line. Your father, someone came this morning with paperwork. Medical transfer authorization. They moved him out of Ridgeview. Marco's voice dropped. The staff said the authorization documents looked correct. They had the trustee signature. They said a doctor came with the transport. Where did they take him? The facility says the paperwork listed a specialized care center in New Jersey. The center's name doesn't pull up any state licensing records. A beat. I've been trying to locate it for 2 hours. Celeste was already writing on the legal pad. She turned it toward Adrian. It's leverage, not medical. Adrian read it. His expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes went very flat and very cold. Find Dominic Serrano, Adrian said into the phone. Only Dominic. Nobody else from the organization. Tell him I need to see him today, whatever he's doing. Gideon's people are at headquarters, Marco said carefully. Russ 6, they've been there since this morning. Rusk said it was a security measure until the council session tonight. Occupying headquarters before the session, Celeste said quietly. She wasn't speaking to Adrian, she was speaking to herself, working through it. He's not waiting for the vote. Adrian hung up. He sat very still for 3 seconds. Then he looked at Celeste. He took my father, Adrian said. The words were simple. They were the simplest thing he had said in 3 days. But the way he said them, the register, the particular quality of flatness that isn't absence of emotion, but the extreme compression of it told Celeste something about what was happening behind his eyes that she hadn't seen before. She had seen Adrian Valenti, handle territorial violence, federal pressure, internal betrayal, and organizational crisis. She had seen him calculating, and cold, and occasionally ruthless. She had not seen him afraid. He was afraid. Not for the empire. Not for the throne. Not for the money. For an old man, in a room somewhere, who had yellow flowers on his nightstand and who had probably given up 11 numbers, while thinking he was helping someone he had known for 30 years. Adrian, she said. He looked at her. He's using your father to make sure you go to that council session without this. She put her hand flat on the ledger. He knows if you go in there with evidence, he loses. So he's forcing you to choose your father or the documentation. I know what he's doing. He doesn't know you've already seen the notepad, she said. He doesn't know I found the trust documentation this morning. He called the council session before he knew how much I had. Adrian was quiet. He's ahead on pieces, Celeste said. But we have the full picture, and he doesn't know that. She paused. We still have time to build this correctly if we move in the next 4 hours. He has my father. I know. She held his gaze, and we're going to get him back. But not by doing what Gideon is expecting you to do. She leaned forward slightly. What does Gideon think you're going to walk into that room and do tonight? Adrian's jaw moved. Come in armed and angry, and give him the image of an unstable man who's let a personal crisis compromise his judgment. Yes, she sat back. So don't do that. He looked at her for a long moment. You want to walk in there and present the evidence, he said. I want to walk in there with you, she said, and to present it together. The silence between them was different from all the previous silences. It had a different texture, not the silence of calculation or grief or rage, but the silence of two people recalibrating the distance between them. They won't respect your testimony, he said, not dismissively as a fact. Whatever you present will be framed as a furious wife manipulating documents. Not if the numbers are independently verifiable. She tapped the ledger. Account numbers don't lie because I'm angry. They're either accurate or they're not. She paused. And if Dominic Serrano verifies them independently, before the meeting, Dominic is 63 years old and one of the most respected men in the organization. Adrian said it slowly. I know. He was my father's captain. He was loyal to Victor before he was loyal to me. Call him, Celeste said. Dominic Serrano answered on the first ring. He listened without interrupting for 4 minutes while Adrian spoke. Then he was quiet for a moment. Send me the account numbers, he said finally. His voice was the kind of deliberate that comes from a lifetime of choosing words, like they cost something. Just the numbers. I'll have my own people run them. You have 4 hours, Adrian said. I know how time works. A pause. Adrian. Is the woman reliable? Adrian looked at Celeste across the motel table. She's the most reliable person I know, he said. There was nothing complicated in the way he said it. Just the flatness of something true. Then I'll call you in 2 hours, Dominic said and hung up. Celeste looked at the clock. 12:17 in the afternoon. We need to know where Victor is before tonight, she said. If Gideon uses your father as leverage at the meeting, and you don't know his locations. I know. Adrian pulled up a map on his phone, New Jersey. Unlicensed facility. Marco's been looking. He set the phone on the table. That means it's a private location, not a real care facility. Celeste was already thinking through the financial trail. The property management company, she said. The one connected to Sabine's registration. They had properties in New Jersey. She reached for a legal pad. 3rd page. There are 2 addresses. She turned to the 3rd page and found them. She wrote them down and slid the pad across to him. He looked at both addresses for a moment. Then he picked up his phone and sent both to Marco with a single line of psst. Check these first. Then he put the phone down and looked at Celeste. She was looking at him too. They had been in the same room for 5 hours, which was the longest they had been in the same space since before the night of the party. And it was strange, not uncomfortable exactly, but textured. Full of the awareness of everything that was not being said, because they didn't have time for it, and the further awareness that the unsaid things were not going anywhere and would eventually need somewhere to go. You should eat something, she said. He almost laughed. Not quite. It came out as a short exhale through his nose. You sound like Elena. Elena's right about most things. He nodded once. I know. He got up and found the vending machine at the end of the walkway and came back with 2 terrible sandwiches and 2 bottles of water. He set one of each in front of her. She ate without tasting it. They both did. At 2:15, Marco texted back, second address. Movement. Older man. White hair, wheelchair transport. 1 guard outside, maybe 2 inside. Adrian read it and turned the phone so Celeste could see. She read it. He's there, Adrian said. Yes, I need to get him out before tonight. I know. She was already thinking through the variables. If Gideon finds out Victor is safe before the meeting, he may move up his timeline or change his approach at the council. You need to get your father out without Gideon knowing until the meeting has already started, which means I can't use any of my regular people. Marco, she said. You trust Marco, I do. 2 men maximum. Quick. No confrontation if it can be avoided. She looked at him steadily. The goal is Victor safe, not a fight. A fight brings attention and gives Gideon a reason to escalate before the meeting. He was already texting. At 2:38, Dominic Serrano called back. 7 of the 9 account numbers check, Dominic said. The 2 that don't trace back to subsidiary accounts under the same structure. They're the same money, different routing. A pause. She built a clean record, Dominic said. The respect in it was understated and therefore real. She's thorough, Adrian said. I'll be at the meeting tonight, Dominic said. And I'll have 2 captains with me who are not Gideon's people. Another pause. Adrian, don't come in armed. Don't come in angry. Come in with the evidence and let the room do what rooms do when they see the truth. You sound like my wife, Adrian said. A brief silence. Your wife sounds like someone worth listening to, Dominic said, and hung up. Adrian set the phone down. Something in his face shifted barely perceptible, but Celeste had 7 years of practice reading him. Dominic's in, she said. Dominic's in. She nodded. Picked up the legal pad. Then we spend the next 5 hours making this airtight. At 4:50 in the afternoon, Marco sent 2 words. Victor safe. Celeste was reading through the ledger when Adrian's phone buzzed on the table. He picked it up, read it, and set it back down. His hand rested flat on the table for a moment. She watched his chest expand with one slow breath and release. Then he picked up his pen and went back to the notes they were preparing for the council session, and his handwriting was steadier than it had been all day. They had 4 hours. In a building in Manhattan, Gideon Rusk was arranging a room, preparing an accusation, and readying the mechanism that would end Adrian Valenti's reign and hand him everything he had spent 3 years building toward. He believed he had leverage. He believed he had timing. He believed the woman with the ledger was still running. He did not know that 42 miles away, in a motel room with bad lighting, and a table too small for 2 people, the mafia boss and the wife he had betrayed were sitting side by side, building the case that would dismantle everything. Gideon had constructed 1 account number, 1 document, 1 undeniable fact at a time. And he did not know that the thing he had spent 3 years calculating had 1 catastrophic flaw built into it from the very beginning. He had never once, in all his careful planning, accounted for what Celeste Arden was actually capable of. They left the motel at 7:15 in the evening. Celeste had changed into the spare clothes from her bag: dark slacks, a gray blouse, flat shoes. Nothing decorative, nothing that announced anything. She had pulled her hair back with the kind of efficiency that has nothing to do with appearance, that has and everything to do with not wanting anything in her face during the next several hours. Adrian had not changed clothes. He was wearing what he had driven to Connecticut in: dark coat, dark shirt, no tie. He looked like a man who had slept in his clothes, which he essentially had. She noticed, without commenting on it, that he had not shaved. There was something almost deliberate about that, or maybe not deliberate but appropriate. The version of Adrian Valenti, who walked into rooms perfectly assembled and projected total control, that version was staying home tonight. What was going to that council meeting was something raw. She was not sure if that was a weakness or an advantage. She decided it was an advantage and filed that calculation away. The ledger was in her bag. The legal pads were in her bag. 3 copies of the key documentation were in 3 separate locations, one set with Dominic's people. One set secured in a location she had not told Adrian about, one in her hands. They drove into Manhattan in near silence, not uncomfortable silence. The silence of two people who have spent 14 hours working side by side on something that required total concentration and are now in the transition between the preparation and the thing itself, and there is nothing useful left to say about what they've prepared. At some point on the FDR, Adrian Celeste. She looked at him. He kept his eyes on the road. "Whatever happens tonight," he said, "you walk out of that building. I intend to. I mean it as a non-negotiable. Not a preference." He paused. "If anything goes sideways, you leave. You take the ledger, and you leave, and you go somewhere safe, and you use what you have." She looked at the side of his face. "And you?" He didn't answer that directly. "Just promise me you walk out." "I'll walk out," she said. "So will you. Stop being dramatic." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, the memory of one. "You've always hated when I'm dramatic," he said. "You were dramatic exactly twice in 7 years," she said. Both times were unnecessary. He almost said something else. She could see it something personal, something that belonged to a different conversation in a different version of their lives. She cut. He let it go, kept driving. The Manhattan streets were doing their normal evening thing, dense, loud, all that density and noise that never quite stops, and that had been the backdrop of Celeste's life for 7 years, and that she had never fully gotten used to, even when she stopped noticing it. They parked 2 blocks from Valenti headquarters, walking distance. Adrian had chosen that, intentionally arriving on foot, without the armored vehicle, without the convoy. He had explained it to her. During the preparation, Gideon would have people watching the buildings approach. He expected Adrian to arrive like a man going to war. They were going to arrive like people who had nothing to hide. "Dominic's inside?" she asked as they got out of the car. "He texted 20 minutes ago. He's there with 2 captains. Rosario and DeLuca, both old guard, both loyal to the bloodline." Adrian straightened his coat. "There are 15 members of the council total. Gideon has the loyalty of maybe 6. The rest are undecided or waiting to see which way the wind is." "Undecided men follow evidence," Celeste said. "Undecided men follow whoever looks like they're winning." He looked at her. "We need to look like we're winning. Then walk like it," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he nodded once, and they walked. The lobby of Valenti headquarters was staffed by 2 men. Celeste didn't recognize Gideon's people, almost certainly, given the way their posture changed, and their eyes went to each other when Adrian walked through the door. Adrian didn't acknowledge them. He walked to the elevator like he owned the building, which he did, and pressed the button, and waited. Celeste stood beside him. One of the men reached for a phone. "Tell him we're here," Adrian said without turning around. "He already knows." The elevator opened. They rode up to the 7th floor in silence. The elevator was the same elevators Celeste had ridden hundreds of times in 7 years of coming to this building. It smelled like the same cleaning product. The light was the same slightly greenish fluorescent. She had always disliked the light in this elevator. The doors opened. The hallway leading to the main council room had 4 men standing in it. Armed not visibly, but she had learned to read the way a coat falls when there's something under it. They moved to let Adrian through. But their body language said they were deciding to let him through, which was different from simply not being in the way. Adrian walked through them without breaking stride. Celeste walked beside him. At the door to the council room, one of the men put a hand up. Mr. Rusk said, "Take your hand down," Adrian said. The man held it for a beat, 2 beats, then lowered it. Adrian opened the door. The council room was a large rectangular space with a long table that seated 20, and tonight seated 14, with 1 seat conspicuously empty at the far end, Adrian's seat, which told you everything about how certain Gideon had been that he wouldn't show. 15 faces turned toward the door. Celeste recognized most of them. She had spent 7 years in rooms adjacent to these men, at dinners, at events, at the edges of conversations she was not formally invited to, but had always understood precisely. She knew which ones were ambitious, which ones were cautious, which ones were loyal to tradition, which ones were loyal to money. She had documented most of them in the ledger. Gideon was at the head of the table, standing, not sitting. He had been in the middle of something when the door opened, and the mid-sentence still hung in the air as he turned. He looked at Adrian. Then he looked at Celeste. Something moved through his expressions that was not quite surprise he had known they might come, but was a recalibration. A man adjusting the parameters of a plan in real time. Sabine Kessler was standing to Gideon's left, slightly behind him. She was in a dark suit. Her face, when it registered Celeste's presence, did something complicated, and then went smooth and controlled. Dominic Serrano was seated 3 chairs down from Gideon's position, with Rosario on one side and DeLuca on the other. He caught Adrian's eye briefly and gave the smallest nod that still constituted a nod. Gideon recovered his voice first. Adrian, measured, almost warm, in the way that a very controlled man can make almost warm sound like a threat. We weren't sure you were coming. I can see that, Adrian said. He looked at his chair at the far end of the table. He did not walk to it. He stopped near the door, with Celeste beside him, and addressed the room. Before we begin, he said, I have something to put in front of this council. This session was called to address specific concerns. Gideon started. I know what it was called to address. Adrian's voice was not raised. It did not need to be, and those concerns deserve a response. So does what I'm about to show you. He looked at Celeste. She opened her bag and took out the documentation. 3 sets she had organized them into packets during the afternoon, each one a clean sequence of account records, dates, and connections, annotated in her precise handwriting, with the methodology for verification. She set a packet in front of Dominic, one in front of Rosario. One she kept. Gideon took 2 steps forward. The testimony of a woman who stole organization documents is not evidence. The account numbers are evidence, Dominic said. His voice was quieter than Gideon's, and it stopped the room more completely. Dominic Serrano did not speak often in group settings, and everyone in the room knew that, which made the times he did speak carry a specific weight. I had them independently verified this afternoon, Dominic continued. He did not look at Gideon. He looked at the men around the table. 7 primary accounts connected through a structure none of you authorized. The transfers go back 37 months. He paused. The money didn't disappear. It was moved into accounts that I can tell you, sitting here tonight, none of us own. The room was very quiet. Gideon's voice was sharp when it came. Dominic, let the woman present, Dominic said. Another silence. Then, from 3 other men around the table, a sound that wasn't agreement, but was the opposite of objection. Gideon looked at Celeste. His eyes were flat and entirely calculating, and she recognized the quality of that gaze, because she had seen it directed at other people in other rooms, the look of a man who is assessing how much damage control is available to him. She met his gaze and held it and began to speak. She spoke for 22 minutes. She had timed the presentation during the afternoon, which Adrian had found both impressive and slightly unsettling. She moved through the documentation in sequence: the earliest transfer, the account origin, the law firm, the timeline of the parallel structure's construction. She explained the methodology clearly enough that men who were not financial experts could follow the logic. She was not dramatic. She was not emotional. She was not the betrayed wife performing for sympathy. She was a woman presenting data, and the data was not ambiguous. Halfway through, Gideon interrupted her 3 times. The first time, these records were assembled by someone with obvious personal motivations. Motivation doesn't change account numbers, Celeste said, and kept going. The second time, the transfers you're describing are consistent with legitimate restructuring that I authorized on behalf of. Show me the authorization documentation, she said. She stopped, looked at him directly. You have authorization records for every financial movement that went through the Valenti organization. Everyone. If these transfers were legitimate, your records show it. She waited 3 full seconds. Show them. Gideon said nothing. She kept going. The third time he interrupted, he changed tactics. This is a woman whose marriage failed, he said to the room. His voice took on a particular quality, not loud, but carrying. She walked out with stolen documents and spent 3 days putting together a narrative that Gideon. Adrian spoke for the first time since handing the floor to Celeste. He said the name, the way you say something that has been sitting in your throat for a long time, and you are finally allowing it out. In 28 years, I have given you more trust than I gave anyone else in this organization, including my own father. He walked forward, slowly, into the room. And you sent men to my wife's safe house in the middle of the night. The room absorbed that. And you moved my father from his care facility, Adrian continued. He stopped about 6 feet from Gideon, not aggressive, deliberate. An old man with dementia. You moved him with forged medical documentation because you needed him as leverage. Gideon's face was controlled. Your father's care arrangements. He's safe, Adrian said, in case that was going to be your next move. He was recovered this afternoon. He watched Gideon recalculate. And the property in New Jersey where you were holding him is currently being documented as we speak. Something flickered across Gideon's expression. Gone fast. But Celeste saw it, and she was fairly certain at least 3 other people in the room saw it too. The flicker of a man understanding that the ground he was standing on was smaller than he thought. Celeste finished the presentation. She set the final page down on the table and looked at the men assembled and let the silence do what silence does when the person speaking has just stopped and what they said is sitting in the room unrefuted. Dominic spoke first. I want to address the council directly. He stood, which was unusual for him. I've been in this organization for 40 years. I served Victor Valenti for 18 of those years. What this woman has shown us tonight is a record of systematic sabotage. Organized, patient, and deliberate. He looked at Gideon. The territorial losses last spring. The Bronx situation. Red Hook, he paused. Those weren't rival families getting lucky. Those were coordinated. And the coordination came from inside this room. The silence after that had a different quality than the silence before it. Gideon moved, not toward Adrian, toward the table. He put both hands on it and leaned forward and addressed the council with the energy of a man who has decided that the only remaining option is forward momentum. What you're looking at is a fabrication assembled by a woman who has been preparing her exit from this marriage for years. His voice was forceful, controlled but forceful. She had access to organizational records. She had motivation. She had time. He looked around the table. I have served this family through 2 successions. I helped build what Adrian inherited. What you are being asked to accept tonight is that I spent 3 decades building this organization so I could secretly destroy it. He let the question sit. Ask yourselves who benefits from Adrian Valenti losing your confidence tonight. It was, Celeste admitted privately, a competent argument. Because competent arguments don't need to be true. They just need to introduce enough doubt in enough minds. And Gideon Rusk had 40 years of experience, reading rooms, and knowing which minds were susceptible to doubt. She watched 3 of the undecided faces shift. Adrian watched them too. He pulled a single page from his coat pocket. He hadn't told her he was going to do this, which meant he had prepared it separately, and she recognized the account number on it immediately. This account, Adrian said, setting the page on the table in front of one of the undecided men, a captain named Ferris, who managed the Queen's operations and whose face had been carefully neutral all evening. This account was accessed 9 days ago, the week before this council session was called. He kept his voice flat. $240,000 moved out of it into a routing number that traces to a name I think this council should hear. He looked at Sabine. She was still standing behind Gideon. Her face had been composed and still throughout the presentation, with the particular stillness of someone who has practiced being still under observation. But something in how Adrian was looking at her made her composure do something at the edges. Sabine Kessler, Adrian said to the room, was introduced to me 4 months ago as a financial consultant. She was introduced through Gideon. He paused. Before she was my consultant, she was the registered contact for a property management company that appears in this documentation 17 times. And before that, she was employed by a firm in Chicago that he paused. That managed the financial wind-down of a crime family in 2019. after their consigliere bought out the assets at a substantial discount. The room turned to look at Sabine. She had gone very still. A different kind of still than before. You did this before, Adrian said. He was talking to Gideon now, in Chicago. You helped construct a family's operation, and then you dismantled it from the inside and walked away with the assets. Sabine was part of that operation too, Gideon started. The Chicago connection is in the ledger, Celeste said quietly. Page 31. The holding company that appears in both the Valenti financial structure and the Chicago wind down shares the same registered agent, the same Elias Forte, who sits on the board of your Midtown law firm. Dead silence. A man at the far end of the table, Toscano, one of the oldest members of the council, who had sat through the entire presentation without a visible reaction, said in a voice like gravel, Gideon. Just the name. Gideon turned toward him. You did this in Chicago, Toscano said. Not a question. An old man arriving at a conclusion he was not happy to arrive at. The armed men at the doors, Gideon's men, had been still throughout, but now one of them shifted his weight, which created a particular kind of tension in the room that every person present recognized immediately. Celeste's hand tightened on the edge of the table. Adrian was already reading the room. She could see him reading it the way she had watched him. For 7 years, the micro adjustments, the weight distribution, the angle of attention. Gideon straightened. He made a decision. She could see him make it. This council was called, he said, to address the fitness of the current administration. That question still stands, regardless of what has been presented here tonight. He looked at the room with the authority of a man who has occupied authority positions long enough to know that authority is sometimes just about who fills the silence most completely. Adrian Valenti allowed his personal life to compromise this organization. That is a fact. Whatever else is being debated tonight. The organization was being compromised, Dominic said, by the man who just told you he's been running it honestly for 30 years. Gideon's armed man at the door moved again, more definitively. Adrian turned toward the movement. Celeste did not look away from Gideon. She watched his face in the moment that his armed man moved, and Adrian turned toward the movement. And in that split second, she saw Gideon's eyes go to her bag, where the ledger was, with an expression that was fast and calculating and hungry, in the way that things are hungry when they know they are running out of time. Don't, she said. She said it quietly, directly to Gideon, just loud enough for the people nearest to them to hear. He looked at her. Whatever you're calculating right now, she said, the documentation doesn't only exist in this room. You know I'm thorough. You've spent the last 3 days learning exactly how thorough I am. She held his gaze without blinking. The information is already somewhere you can't reach. Multiple somewheres, she paused. If anything happens to anyone in this room tonight, it surfaces everywhere. Every account, every connection, everything. The room was completely still. Gideon looked at her for a long moment. She had the particular sensation of being assessed at depth, a careful mind working through every variable of what she had just said, determining if it was a bluff. It was not a bluff. She let him see that. His armed man stopped moving. What happened next took 11 minutes and was not violent. It was something more thorough than violence and considerably more final. 3 of the undecided council members asked Dominic to confirm the account verification independent of Celeste's documentation. Dominic confirmed it. He read from his own notes, which his people had prepared from their own research, and the numbers matched Celeste's numbers. A captain named Vitale, who had been silent the entire evening, asked a single question. The Chicago operation is there, documentation connecting Gideon directly, or only through intermediaries? Page 31 through 34, Celeste said. The registered agent ties the Chicago holding company directly to the Midtown firm. There is a signature on the original Delaware incorporation. It matches Gideon's signature on the Valenti Trust documentation I submitted. She paused. I'm not a handwriting expert, but I have both documents here, and this council can look at both. She put them both on the table. Vitale looked at them for a while. Gideon's remaining supporters around the table. There had been 6 at the start of the evening, went from 6 to 4 to 2 in the space of those 11 minutes as the men who had been calculating did the math and reached the Conclusion that math arrives at when the numbers are clear. When it was over, when the room had reached its own conclusion, in the way rooms do when the weight of evidence finally exceeds the weight of competing interests, Gideon looked at Adrian across the long table. The armed men at the doors had stepped back. Sabine had not moved from her position behind Gideon's chair, but she had the quality of someone calculating an exit. Gideon's face was, for the first time in the evening, stripped of its professional arrangement. What was underneath was not fear exactly. It was something more cold than fear. The face of a man who has spent 30 years being the most patient person in every room he entered, who is arriving at the understanding that patience has a ceiling. "Where is my father?" Adrian said. The room went still again. Gideon looked at him. Something measured the options available and found them inadequate. "A house in Cliffside Park," he said. "I told the people there to keep him comfortable." "Is he being held?" A pause. "He's being kept safe." "That's not what I asked." Another pause. "He can't go anywhere on his own," Gideon said. "He doesn't know where he is." The words landed in the room like something physical. Several of the men who had been neutral looked away. Not from the scene from Gideon. The particular look of men who have made their final calculation and are finished with the option they've dismissed. Adrian took one breath, then another. "You'll give the address to Dominic," he said. It was not a question or a request. Gideon wrote it on a piece of paper and slid it across the table to Dominic without further argument, which was the most telling thing he had done all evening. The absence of argument where argument had been texture of the entire night. Victor Valenti's location passed from Gideon's piece of paper to Dominic's hands. With that transfer, something else passed too, though it was harder to name. The authority of the room, maybe. The consensus, arrived at without a vote, of 15 men who understood that what had happened in the last hour constituted a verdict. Dominic passed the address to Rosario, who stepped out of the room. The council sat with the aftermath. Adrian walked to his chair at the far end of the table. He did not sit in it. He stood behind it, with his hands on the back of it, and looked at the room. When he spoke, his voice was quiet. The kind of quiet that requires more effort than volume. "I have something to say to this council," he said. "And I need you to hear it clearly, because I'm going to say it once." The room attended to him. He looked at Gideon first, then at the men around the table, then briefly at Celeste, who was standing to the side of the room near the documentation she had laid out. "The Valenti criminal organization is done," Adrian said. The silence was immediate and total. "Not because of what Gideon did," he said. "Not because of what's in the ledger, because of what I'm choosing." He stood straighter. Gideon spent 3 years trying to take this empire. He wanted the throne. He paused. "I'm going to do something he never planned for." His hands tightened on the back of the chair, then released. "I'm going to remove the throne." No one spoke. Legitimate businesses will be separated from criminal operations under full legal disclosure. Compromised assets will be surrendered to the relevant authorities through an arranged process that protects anyone in this room who cooperates. The old alliances, the arrangements that require what we have required end. His eyes moved across the assembled faces. "You each have a choice to make about how you proceed from tonight. I can't make it for you, but the Valenti family organization as it has existed is finished as of this conversation." He stepped back from the chair. "There's nothing left to inherit," he said, and looked directly at Gideon. "Whatever you thought you were going to walk away with, it's gone." The room sat with that. Gideon's face did something complicated, and then went very still. Sabine, behind him, had finally calculated her exit. She moved toward the door and was stopped, not violently, just stopped by Rosario, who had returned from the hallway. She stopped. The room breathed. Celeste stood near the wall and watched the Mafia boss dismantle the Mafia, and felt something she had not expected to feel in this room on this night. Not triumph, not relief, something quieter than both. Something that had to do with the particular weight of witnessing a person do the hardest thing they've done, and knowing that the hardest thing doesn't look like what you imagined it would look like, and that it matters anyway, possibly more because of that. She picked up her bag. She put the remaining documentation back inside it. She was ready to walk out of this building. But first she waited, because Victor Valenti's address was in Dominic's hands, and Rosario needed to confirm the recovery. And Adrian was standing in front of 15 men who were rearranging their understanding of the next 10 years of their lives. And the night was not quite finished doing what nights do when they contain this much consequence. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize, but the format 2 digits, stop 4 digits. A word was the same coded structure she had used years ago to communicate with a lawyer she had retained privately, whose existence she had told no one. The text said received, secured, confirmed. The external copies of the documentation had been received and secured by the attorney. The final safeguard was in place. She put her phone back in her bag. Whatever happened next, whatever Gideon did, whatever any of these men decided, whatever the legal consequences of the night's admissions turned out to be, there was nothing left that could suppress what Celeste had built. The record existed. Multiple copies. Multiple locations. In the hands of someone whose legal obligation was to her, not to anyone in this room. She looked across the space at Adrian. He was still standing at the head of the table. He was looking at her too. And in that look across a long table, in a room full of men whose world had just shifted on its axis, there was something neither of them said and both of them understood, which was that the accounting was not finished between them. And the morning was still coming, and there were things that needed to be said that had nothing to do with ledgers or council sessions, or the architecture of an empire being deliberately taken apart. But those things could wait until they were outside. Until then, the room was still doing what the room needed to do, and Adrian Valenti was still standing in it. And Celeste was still standing with her bag on her shoulder, and the weight of 3 days and 40-some hours of no sleep behind her eyes. And Gideon Rusk was sitting at a table where the mathematics had. The mathematics had finally run out of room. That was the only way to describe what happened to Gideon Rusk in the final minutes inside that council room. Not a dramatic collapse, not a confession delivered with theatrical weight, but the quiet, terrible arithmetic of a man who had counted on certain variables remaining in place and was now sitting in the aftermath of every one of them having shifted. He sat at the table. He did not look diminished exactly. Gideon had too much practiced composure for diminishment to show quickly. But there was something gone from him, the particular forward energy of a man with a plan. The plan was over. The room knew it. He knew the room knew it. The remaining 2 men who had been in his column looked at the table, at each other, at the middle distance. The calculation they were doing was visible if you knew how to read it. Not whether Gideon had done what the documentation said, but whether loyalty to a losing position was worth the cost of maintaining it. It was not. They were reaching that conclusion in real time, and Gideon could see them reaching it. Sabine's was still near the door, with Rosario between her and the exit. She had stopped trying to calculate her way out, and had gone very still in the way of someone who has decided that stillness is the safest available option. Adrian stood at the head of the table. He looked at Gideon for a long moment, the look of a man examining something he thought he knew, and is now holding at a new angle in new light, seeing the grain of it differently. Not rage. Something older and more tired than rage. The Chicago family, Adrian said. What happened to them? It was not quite a question. It was the thing he needed said out loud in this room, so that the men in it understood the full shape of what they had been sitting next to. Gideon looked at him, decided apparently that the accounting was past the point where denial had any utility. The Castellano operation collapsed in 2019, he said. His voice was even. Professional, almost. The voice of a man reporting on something that had happened to other people. It was a failing organization. The leadership was fractured. The financial structure was unsustainable. He paused. I helped structure the wind down. The assets were redistributed. To yourself, Dominic said. Gideon looked at him. To people who could use them effectively, including yourself, Dominic repeated. A pause. I was compensated for my work. Yes, and the people inside that organization who trusted you, Adrian said. The soldiers, the men who had families. What happened to them? Gideon was quiet. What happened to them, Gideon? They found other arrangements. His voice had gone slightly flat. That's how these things work. Organizations end. People adapt. Two of them didn't adapt, Dominic said. He reached into his jacket pocket and put a folded piece of paper on the table. I had my people pull the records this afternoon when the Chicago connection surfaced. 2 men from the Castellano operation died in 2020. Circumstances that were listed as accidents. He looked at Gideon without looking away. They were both in positions where they had information about the financial wind down. The room absorbed that. Gideon did not respond. His non-response was its own kind of answer, and every person in the room received it as such. Adrian looked at the paper on the table. He did not pick it up. He looked at it the way you look at something you wish had a different shape. You've been doing this your whole career, he said. He said it without anger. That was the part that was hardest to watch, that there was no anger in it anymore. Just the flat, exhausted recognition of something true. Building things, learning them from the inside, taking them apart. I built the Valenti organization, Gideon said. I built it as much as you did, as much as your father did. And you were going to take it the same way you took the Castellano operation. I was going to run it better than you were, Gideon said, and for the first time in the evening there was something unguarded in his voice, something that was not calculated. That was the actual man speaking, rather than the performance of the man. You inherited this. You didn't build it from nothing. You walked into a structure that was already standing, and you've been operating it since you were 31 years old and spent 7 years married to a woman whose mind was sharper than yours, and you didn't even notice. He stopped. He stopped. Something crossed his face. I noticed. I've always noticed. I've been doing the actual work of this organization since before you were old enough to be in the room. The silence after that was different from all the silences that had preceded it, because there was something in it that was true, and truth has a specific acoustic quality in a room, and everyone heard it. Adrian stood with it. He didn't argue. He didn't defend himself. He looked at Gideon across the long table and took in the thing that was true and held it separate from the things that were not true and didn't confuse them. You're right about some of that, he said finally. Gideon blinked. He had not expected that. I did inherit what you helped build, Adrian said. And I've operated it with your counsel for 7 years. And I have not always made the best use of what I had available to me. He paused. That doesn't make what you did a transaction. You don't get to steal from someone because you help them build the thing you're stealing. He looked at him steadily. And you don't get to use an old man with dementia as a negotiating chip and call it management. Gideon looked away. It was a small movement. But in 30 years of knowing Gideon Rusk, Adrian had never seen him look away from a confrontation first. It was over. Not with a shot fired or a door kicked in or any of the things that endings in their world usually required. It was over the way a tide goes out gradually, and then completely, and the shore that's left is different from what it was before. Adrian straightened. He addressed the room. Dominic has the location for Victor. Rosario is already in motion. He looked at the assembled council. What happens with Gideon's assets, his people, and the outstanding questions about the Chicago operation, those aren't decisions for tonight. Tonight, I've said what I needed to say to this council. The rest is going to happen through a process, and that process is going to take time, and I'm going to be available to it. He paused. Anyone in this room who has information relevant to what's been discussed tonight is going to want to think carefully about how they participate in what comes next. That's not a threat. That's just arithmetic. He stepped back from the chair. He looked at Celeste. She was ready. They walked out. The night air outside Valenti headquarters was cold, in the way Manhattan is cold. In the small hours, not the clean cold of open country, but the particular urban cold that comes off concrete and carries the smell of exhaust and food, and 8 million overlapping lives being lived at close range. Celeste stood on the sidewalk and took a breath of it. Adrian came out behind her. He stood beside her. Neither of them moved toward the car immediately. Rosario texted, Adrian said. He was looking at his phone. They're at Cliffside Park. Victor is he's disoriented, but he's physically okay. They're bringing him back tonight. Good, Celeste said. They said he thought he was on a trip. Adrian's voice was carefully neutral. He told one of Rosario's men that Gideon had taken him to see a house. Like a social visit, he paused. He didn't understand. Celeste looked at the side of his face. He kept him comfortable, she said. Whatever else, Victor was physically safe. I know. He put the phone in his pocket. I know that. It doesn't. He stopped. He gave those numbers because he thought he was helping an old friend. She let that sit without filling it. They stood on the sidewalk outside a building that had been the center of a criminal empire for 15 years, in a city that was doing its indifferent late-night thing around them. And the enormity of the last 72 hours was somewhere in both of them, finding its level, the way water finds level after something disturbs it. Adrian looked at her. You should sleep, he said. She almost laughed. That's your first concern right now. You haven't slept in how long? I'm functional. Celeste. His voice was quiet. You've been running on nothing for 3 days. So have you. I'm used to it. You really think that's true, she said. And something in how she said it made it land differently than an argument, more like an observation. The kind that doesn't require a response. He was quiet. They walked to the car. She did not go back to the penthouse. She had known she wouldn't. She had known that since Connecticut, since the motel, since long before tonight. Adrian had not suggested it, which told her he understood it too. He drove her to a hotel on the Upper West Side, one she had chosen herself with cash 2 days ago as a secondary option, because Celeste always had a secondary option. He pulled up in front of it and put the car in park and sat with his hands on the wheel. Thank you, she said. For the first time in 3 days, it felt inadequate, those 2 words, for what she had done, for what she had risked. For 40 hours of no sleep, and a gravel road in Connecticut, and a stranger's truck, and a $47 motel room with the chain on the door. Don't, she said. He looked at her. Don't thank me like it was a favor, she said. I did what needed doing. For Victor. For the men in that organization who didn't deserve to have it handed to Gideon. For myself, she paused. Not for you, I know, he said. I know it wasn't for me. Silence. I'm sorry, he said. He said it the way he had said everything, for the last 3 days, without decoration. Just the words with all their weight. Not I'm not saying it to get something. I'm not saying it because the situation calls for it. I'm saying it because I spent 7 years with you, and I treated what you were like. It was furniture in a room I owned, and I was wrong, and I am sorry. She looked at her hands in her lap. I know you are, she said. That's not forgiveness, he said. Not a question. Not quite a statement. More like a man confirming a map coordinate. No, she said. It's not. He nodded. Looked at the street. Where will you go, he asked. After tonight. After all of this settles. My foundation, she said. I've been running it at half capacity for 3 years because of she stopped. Because of everything that went with being your wife. I'm going to run it properly now. It'll take about 2 years to restructure it into something completely independent. The housing work, he said. He knew about the foundation. He had always known about it in the vague way that people know about things that don't command their full attention. She had never pushed for his attention on it. Another thing she was finished doing. The housing work, she confirmed, and legal support. Employment programs, she paused. There's a lot to do. I've had a plan for a long time. He was quiet for a moment. You've been building toward this for a while, yes. The foundation, the compartment, the accounts. He wasn't accusing her. He was understanding something, and the understanding was arriving with the particular quality of something that's a little painful to receive. You've been preparing an exit for years. I've been preparing a life, she said carefully. There's a difference. I wasn't looking for a reason to leave. I was making sure that when I made a decision, it was my decision and not a crisis. She looked at him. The night of the party was the decision. Everything I had was so I could make it clearly. He sat with that. I thought I knew you, he said. Seven years and I thought I knew you. You knew the parts I showed you, she said. And you assumed the rest was like the parts you saw. She said it without heat. It was just true, and they were both tired enough that just true was all that was left. That's what people do, so especially people who are used to being the most important thing in a room. He flinched, barely. But she saw it. I was important to you, she said. I know that. I'm not saying you didn't care about me. She paused, choosing the words carefully because the words mattered, and because she was too tired for anything but precision. I'm saying that caring about someone and actually seeing them are two different things. And you cared about me, but you didn't see me. And I let that happen longer than I should have because I was good at making myself useful, and I told myself that being useful was the same as being valued. The street outside was doing its quiet late-night thing. A cab passed. Somewhere down the block, a door opened and closed. Was it, he asked? Was it what? The same. Being useful and being valued. She thought about that genuinely the way the question deserved. No, she said, but I knew the difference and I stayed anyway. So, that's on me too. She looked at him directly. I'm not standing outside my part in how we got here. I made choices too. I let things be what they were, because changing them would have required a kind of confrontation I kept deciding I didn't want to have. She paused. Until I didn't have a choice anymore. He turned and looked at her. Really looked at her, the way he hadn't looked at her enough in 7 years, which was the most painful irony of sitting in a car outside a hotel at 2 a.m. with the ruins of everything around them. If I had been different, he said. Not what happened with Sabine, I mean structurally. If I had been the kind of person who saw you, properly. He stopped. Would we be here? She thought about it. She owed him a real answer. I don't know, she said. Maybe. People change. Circumstances change. I don't know who we would have been in a different architecture. She paused. But I know who we were in this one. He nodded. Slow. The nod of a man receiving something that costs something. She picked up her bag. Get some sleep, she said. Victor is going to need you present tomorrow. Not the Mafia Boss version, just his son. Be his son. Something moved through his face. Yeah. And Adrian. She had one hand on the door. What you said in there tonight. About dismantling it. She looked at him. Was it real? He met her eyes. Yes, it's going to cost you everything. I know. Not just the criminal operation. The status. The structure. The identity. She watched him carefully. You've been Don Valenti since you were 31. That's 7 years of being the most powerful man in every room. Walking away from that is not a speech. It's a long, ugly daily process. I know what it is, do you? A pause. No, he said. Not yet, but I will. She held his gaze for a moment. Then she opened the door. Good night, Adrian. Good night, Celeste. She walked into the hotel without looking back, not because she didn't want to, but because she had learned a long time ago that looking back in a moment of resolution muddies the resolution, and she was very tired and needed the clarity to stay intact until she could sleep. At the front desk, she asked for her room key. She rode the elevator alone. She sat on the bed in the dark for a while with her bag in her lap and the particular exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something enormous and has just set it down and can now feel every muscle that was engaged in the carrying. Then she lay down, fully dressed, and was asleep in approximately 3 minutes. In the weeks that followed, the dismantling of the Valenti criminal organization was not the clean institutional process that Adrian had described in the council room. It was messier than that, and slower and considerably more painful in the specific ways that things are painful when they have been built over a long time and dismantled in a shorter one. There were lawyers. Many lawyers over many months. There were conversations with federal prosecutors that were conducted through channels that the prosecutors themselves found unusual and that required a specific kind of legal architecture to make viable. Dominic Serrano was instrumental in those early conversations, his credibility in the traditional organization lending a legitimacy to the process that would have been harder to establish otherwise. Some men in the organization cooperated. Some didn't. Some who said they would cooperate changed their position when they understood what cooperation actually required. Adrian sat through all of it with the patience of a man who has made a decision and is now living inside the consequences of it, which is harder than making the decision. Gideon's parallel financial structure was comprehensively unwound, using Celeste documentation as the foundational map. The forensic accountant Adrian had hired that first sleepless morning 3 days before the council session, a lifetime ago, in organizational terms turned out to be worth considerably more than his fee. Gideon's two remaining supporters from the council session were the first to provide substantive cooperation. The documentation Celeste had assembled left them very little room for an alternative strategy. Gideon himself was a longer, harder process. He had lawyers who were good at what they did. He contested the account documentation, the methodology of its construction, the chain of custody. He argued that a woman with a personal grievance against his primary client had assembled records with the express intent of. The account numbers didn't care about intent. They were accurate or they weren't. They were verified by Dominic's people, by the forensic accountant, by a third independent analysis conducted by a firm that had no connection to anyone in the room that night. They were accurate. The Chicago documentation, the connection to the Castellano operations wind down, the two deaths in 2020, moved through a separate investigative process that Celeste was not part of and did not want to be part of. That process was underway when she left for her foundation restructuring, and it was still underway months later. She checked on it, occasionally through her attorney, and then stopped checking. It was out of her hands, and she had other work to do. Sabine Kessler, who had spent the night of the council session, standing near a door she couldn't reach, made a decision that surprised everyone, including Gideon's lawyers. She cooperated, fully and early, and with a specificity of detail about the Chicago operations' financial structure that answered questions investigators hadn't yet known to ask. Whatever Sabine had been, a mechanism, a participant, someone who had done what she was positioned to do, she was also a person who could read a situation and understood when the situation had fundamentally changed. She identified Elias Forte, the registered agent who threaded through all of it, as the financial architect of both the Chicago wind down and the Valenti parallel structure. Forte was arrested in April. The legal proceedings were still ongoing 6 months after the council session and showed no sign of moving quickly, because the legal proceedings of complicated financial crimes rarely do. Adrian sold the penthouse in March. It took 3 weeks to clear out, which surprised him. He had thought of himself as someone who did not accumulate, but 7 years in one place leaves more than you expect. He donated most of the furniture to a charity that Celeste's foundation had worked with, which he had looked up and arranged without telling her, and which she found out about through the charity's executive director, who sent her a thank you note. She read the note twice and filed it. He gave up the armored cars. The security detail was reduced and then eliminated as the criminal organization's dissolution progressed, and the targets on his back were systematically addressed through the legal process. He kept Marco on for 6 months in an administrative capacity, and then let him go with enough severance to be meaningful and a genuine handshake, which Marco received with the particular expression of a man who has been loyal to something for a long time and is now holding the end of it. He stopped being Don Valenti. This was not an event. It was a process. It happened in increments, across months, the increments being specific moments where the identity was not available and he had to be something else, and over time the something else accumulated into a shape. He did not find it easy. He found it hard in the specific ways she had said. It would be hard, the loss of the status, the structure, the specific kind of certainty that comes from being the most dangerous option in any room. He had not understood when he made the speech in the council room. That certainty was what he would miss most. Not the power, exactly. The certainty that the power provided. The removal of ambiguity. Ordinary life is full of ambiguity. He was learning that. He saw a therapist, which he told no one for the first 2 months, and then stopped hiding it was its own form of the old posturing, and he was trying to be finished with that. He did not contact Celeste for 4 months, not because he had been told not to. She had not given him rules, but because he understood, in a way he had not understood before, that giving her space was not a gesture or a tactic. It was what she had asked for and what she deserved, and doing it was its own practice in being the kind of person who could do it. He visited Victor twice a week. Victor was in a new care facility, smaller, quieter, chosen by Adrian without input from anyone else. Some weeks, Victor recognized him clearly. Some weeks he called him by his brother's name, which Adrian had not corrected him on since the previous winter. They sat in the garden when the weather permitted. Victor sometimes talked about things that had happened in the 1980s with the precision of complete clarity, and sometimes asked where Rosario was, his wife, dead for 11 years. Adrian answered those questions carefully, without force, the way the facility's counselor had taught him. He had learned things in these visits that he had not known how to learn before. How to be present in a room without being in charge of it. How to let someone else set the pace of a conversation. How to sit with a silence that wasn't about strategy. He was not good at these things yet. He was learning them. In the garden one afternoon in late November, Victor had one of his clear days. He looked at Adrian with the full focus of his earlier self, the man who had built the original empire, who had been the most feared name in the city for 2 decades, and said, "Where's Celeste?" Adrian looked at his hands. "She's working," he said. "She runs a foundation. She does good work." Victor was quiet for a moment. She was always the smart one in that marriage. Adrian looked at him. "Yeah," he said. "She was." Victor nodded, satisfied, and turned his face back toward the garden. The foundation's restructuring took 13 months instead of 2 years, because Celeste worked the way she always had, with a precision that was difficult to pace herself away from. The new offices were on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown that had nothing to do with anything she had previously been connected to. She had chosen the building for its light, east-facing windows that got good morning sun, which she had always preferred and had never had in the penthouse because the penthouse faced the wrong direction. She hired 4 staff members in the first 6 months. All women, which was not a deliberate policy so much as the outcome of interviewing the most qualified applicants and finding that the most qualified applicants were women. She noted this and moved on. The work was concrete. Housing placement, legal support for residents, navigating eviction proceedings, employment pathways for people coming out of transitional housing. It was not glamorous work. It involved a great deal of paperwork, a great deal of phone calls to agencies that put you on hold, and a great deal of meetings with city officials who ranged from genuinely helpful to performatively engaged. Celeste found she preferred the paperwork to the meetings, which had always been true, but she had never previously been in a position to act on the preference. Her name was on the door, Celeste Arden, Executive Director. She had stood in front of it on the first day, alone, before any of the staff arrived, and looked at it for a while. Just her name, her own name, which she had kept through the marriage, one of several quiet decisions that turned out to matter. She went inside and made coffee and sat at her desk and started working. There were days that were harder than the work. The marriage had left marks that were not visible in any particular way, but that she encountered in specific moments: a dinner alone where the silence had a different texture than she expected, a night where the work stopped and there was nothing between her and the memories of 7 years, and she had to simply sit with them and wait for them to pass, which they did slowly, imperfectly, the way these things do. She saw a friend from her years before the marriage, a woman named Dee, who had been her closest friend before Adrian, and who had remained peripherally in her life through the marriage, and who had been the first person Celeste called 3 weeks after the council session, and who had cried on the phone in a way that Celeste found both touching and slightly overwhelming. Dee came to New York in October. They had dinner in a restaurant that had nothing to do with anyone Celeste had previously known. Dee talked about her life in Boston, her kids, a renovation she was in the middle of. Celeste talked about the foundation. At the end of dinner, Dee said, "Are you okay?" "Actually okay. Not the version you tell people." Celeste thought about it. "I'm not okay," she said. "I'm in the middle of something, building something. That's uncomfortable in the way that building things is uncomfortable." She paused. "But it's mine. That part is new and it's yes. That part is okay." Dee looked at her. "And the other stuff?" "The other stuff is what it is," Celeste said. "I don't need it to be different than it is," Dee nodded. She had known Celeste long enough to recognize when the answer was the real answer. "Okay," she said. They split the check. Celeste paid her half and did not think about it. The package arrived on a Tuesday in December, 14 months after the night of the party. It was small, standard mailing envelope, her name handwritten on the front, In handwriting she recognized immediately, the way you recognize certain things in your body before your mind catches up. She opened it at her desk. Inside was a photograph. Small, printed on regular photo paper, the way people used to print photographs before the various services that did it more beautifully made. Regular photo paper feel like a choice. The photograph was of the Connecticut safe house. Not the motel, the original safe house, on the 2-lane road. The one she had rented for 8 months and prepared and stocked and told herself she was probably being overly cautious. The one where she had sat at the kitchen table the first night with the ledger open and the coffee going cold and the financial trail unraveling in front of her. The photograph was taken from outside, at a slight distance. She could see the window above the kitchen sink, the one she had stood at when she was trying to control the feeling that wanted to move through her too fast. She sat with it for a moment. There was no letter, no card, no explanation. On the back of the photograph in the same handwriting, whenever, one word. She sat at her desk in her east-facing office with the December light coming through the windows and held the photograph in both hands and thought about that word. Not soon. Not please. Not I've changed. Look at what I've done. Give me another chance. Whenever. The word of a man who had finally understood that a woman's time belongs to herself. That a door is not a demand. That the most powerful thing he could offer her was not a promise or a gesture or a demonstration. It was the absence of pressure. The space to be the one who decides if and when and whether. She recognized what it had cost him. Adrian Valenti, who had run an empire on the certainty that he controlled the terms of every negotiation, had sent her a single word that surrendered all the terms. She sat with it for a long time. Then she set the photograph on the desk, face up, in the corner where the light was good. She picked up her pen and went back to work. That evening she walked home through Manhattan instead of taking a cab. It was cold, but not brutally so. The streets were doing their December thing, the lights, the particular density of people moving through the last weeks of the year, the smell of the city doing what the city does in cold weather. She walked at her own pace, which was not hurried. She thought about the photograph on her desk, which she was not going to move. She thought about the word on the back of it, and what it meant and what it did not mean and what she was going to do with it, which was nothing immediate and nothing forced and nothing that came from anywhere but herself. She thought about Victor in his garden. She thought about Dominic Serrano, who had called her 3 weeks after the council session, not to debrief or discuss strategy, but simply to say that in 40 years he had never seen anyone do what she had done in that room, and that her father, she had mentioned her father once in a conversation years ago, would have been proud. She had thanked him, and they had not spoken since, but the call had mattered in a way she did not have precise language for. She thought about Gideon, who was somewhere in a legal process that would take years, and whose outcome she was not certain of, and who she had decided to stop tracking, because tracking it was keeping her connected to something she needed to be finished with. She thought about Sabine, which she did less often than she expected to, and with less specific feeling than she expected to. Sabine had been a mechanism in someone else's plan, and had eventually chosen to stop being one. Celeste had her own complicated history of continuing in situations longer than she should have. She was not going to spend her energy on perfect moral clarity about Sabine Kessler. She crossed 57th Street and felt the wind come off the Hudson from the west, which was cold and real and present. She thought about Adrian selling the penthouse. She had found out about that through a property record search she had done in February, not because she was tracking him, but because she had wanted to know if it was real. It was real. He had listed it for significantly less than market value and sold it in 11 days, which suggested he had wanted it gone quickly. She thought about what it takes for a person to dismantle the architecture of their own identity voluntarily. The specific courage of it, not the dramatic courage of walking into a council room, but the daily, grinding courage of becoming someone different from who you were on a Tuesday morning when there's no audience and no crisis, and just the ordinary work of being a changed person. She had been doing that work herself for 14 months, and she knew what it required. She was not finished with it. She did not know if he was finished with it either. She knew what he had done. She knew that selling the penthouse and giving up the cars and sitting in a therapist's office and learning how to be a son instead of a Don were real things that had happened and were continuing to happen. She did not know what he was inside all of that. She had not seen him in 14 months. She knew the man he had been. She did not yet know who he was becoming, and she would not know without the kind of slow, unperformative evidence that can only accumulate over time and cannot be rushed. The word on the back of the photograph understood that. Whenever she reached her building and went inside and rode the elevator to the floor she had chosen and unlocked the door she had chosen and stood in the apartment she had built for herself in the months since the night of the party, which was nothing like the penthouse. It was small by the standards she had lived with. The light in the mornings was good. It had a kitchen she cooked in herself and a desk by the window where she did work she had chosen. It had her name on the lease. She made tea and sat by the window and looked at the city for a while. Manhattan below and around her, doing what it always did, indifferent and enormous and full of every kind of life being lived. She thought, I am okay, not performing okay, not constructing okay for the benefit of anyone watching. Just actually, in this specific moment, sitting with tea in her own apartment, with her own name on the door of her own office and her own work to go back to tomorrow morning. Okay, not the end of everything difficult, not the resolution of every question, including the question sitting in a corner of her desk in the form of a photograph and a single word. Just, okay, present, functional, hers. She sat with that for a while and let it be enough. Later she would tell Dee in a phone call, 3 weeks after December, in the new year, when the photograph had been on her desk long enough that she had stopped noticing it was there, and started noticing it was there again, that she had not yet decided what whenever meant. You'll know, Dee said. Maybe, Celeste said. You always know, Dee said. You just make yourself wait until you're sure. Celeste thought about that. Is that a flaw? I think it's you, Dee said. She thought about that for the rest of the evening. 6 months later, on a morning in June, when the east-facing windows were doing the thing they did in early summer, that particular quality of warm light that she had chosen the office for Celeste was at her desk, working through a grant application for the employment program when her assistant knocked and opened the door. There's a man here, the assistant said. She was 26 and perceptive, in the way that young women who have grown up navigating uncertain situations are perceptive. He says he doesn't have an appointment. He says he doesn't expect one. A pause. He's waiting in the lobby. Celeste set her pen down. What's his name? She asked. He said to tell you it's Adrian. The assistant paused. He seems like a regular person. I know he's probably not, but he seems like one. Celeste was quiet for a moment. Tell him I'll be down in 10 minutes, she said. The assistant nodded and left. Celeste sat at her desk for a moment, looking at the grant application. She thought about the photograph on the corner of her desk, which she had not moved in 6 months. She thought about whenever, and what it meant, and whether this was the answer to it, or the beginning of finding out. She did not know. That was the thing she had to be able to hold the not knowing. Whether Adrian Valenti was becoming, or was genuinely trying to become, the kind of man who could meet her as an equal. Whether the work he had done in the last 14 months was the beginning of something real or the most elaborate performance of change she had ever witnessed. Whether the feeling she had sitting in her own office in the June light, looking at the corner where the photograph was clarity or hope or something that required more evidence than she currently had. She didn't know. She put the grant application in her folder. She stood up. She straightened her jacket, which was her own jacket in her own office above a city, where her name was on the door, and walked to the elevator and pressed the button and waited. The elevator doors opened. She stepped in. She rode down. She was not in a hurry. She did not need to be in a hurry, because the choice was hers, and she was the one who got to decide the pace of it and everything else. And whatever was waiting in the lobby, whether it turned out to be the beginning of something or the necessary final conversation of something finished, or just a man standing in an office building on a Tuesday morning who was no longer a mafia boss and was not yet sure what he was, Instead, she was going to walk into it as herself. Not his wife, not the woman who left, not the woman who stayed too long, or the woman who walked away in the night, or the woman who sat in a Connecticut kitchen at 2 in the morning. Stop reconstructing the evidence of a betrayal that ran deeper than the one she thought she was documenting. Just Celeste Arden, who had survived 7 years and 3 days and 14 months, and had built something with her own hands that carried only her own name, who was walking into a lobby on a June morning because she had chosen to. The elevator reached the ground floor. The doors opened. She stepped out into the light.